May I start by saying I'm not very good at limiting my words, and never will be. Well, I have big appetite. I'm going to primarily respond to what's been said as opposed to go into a lot of history, because I imagine what you want to know is going to come through a Q&A. But let me hit on a couple of very critical points. One issue that does not get magnified to the degree it should was the birth of the artist community because of the cheap rent in this area. I consider in our public-private partnerships, one of the key ingredients was the artist community in Emeryville. And the good fortune that they were here and the creativity and the chi energy that was in the air. Because it allowed us to do a lot of things that couldn't have been done in a lot of other communities. The stability that both Charlie and Pat discussed was the overwhelming factor of what made a public-private partnership successful. Having John Flores and Pat O'Keefe as partners, having 3 critical council members, one who's still serving, Nora Davis, who wouldn't allow us to name the railroad station after her because she doesn't want to die yet, but that said, I was willing to bury her there, but on many an occasion. I think it was that is the critical ingredient, that you can't have too much political interference. The political process has to be a governor that has an alignment of interests, where there's a commonality, where we magnify the 60 to 80% we all agree on and accomplish those goals and try to continue the dialogue of where we don't agree. The agreement to disagree is equally as important to the success of a community as any other factor. Because, as you know, because in your country right now you have polarized politics, in this country we're off the chart polarized. So there has to be both the concept that Ed always pronounced on the macro basis, as well as the incremental improvement on a micro basis. And those micro bases start with one of the more important issues that got overlooked in Emeryville for a while, and that's education. If you draw a circle where people want to be, it starts with the schools. If you have good schools, the businesses want to be there, your residential community will have incremental value, people will want to live there, and family housing is a key ingredient to people rooting in a community. Now, why did I start off on artists, public-private partnerships, and education? Because it's a convergence of forces. Yes, I mean, you're looking at one of the luckiest people on earth. I got to play social engineer in partnership and collaborate with some great people. All of what we do is a collaboration. And never lose sight of where the next gem's coming from. Because that gem may be in a regression analysis the critical factor that gives you the most interesting aspect that will change the cultural fabric in that community for the next 10 to 20 years. One of the things that happened, that ingredient, was life science. And I know you all want to know, because for 20 years people have been calling, how do you do it? Well, you start with Berkeley, UCSF, and Stanford University. When you have those 3 universities at work, very similar to what you have in Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, you have already the platforms in place. When I came along, I took the wrong left turn. I was into restoration and rehabilitation, or as my oldest calls me, a burnt-out hippie, you know what. And that said, all of a sudden I was running across a lot of professors, and their whole augmented income came from working for pharmaceutical companies or research companies or doing research for larger corporations. Suddenly some of them got ideas, why am I taking this on an hourly basis when I can start my own company? And as Ed knows, I mean, I remember the days where I was, Cetus was one of my first tenants. And we had to put blue ink, red ink, yellow ink in canisters, so when they brought a bunch of people around to raise money, everyone said, oh my God, this is science. And you think that that didn't happen, but it was Hollywood all the way. And Cetus was the first large life science. In those days, we had no name, so we gave it a name, biotech. And it came from a PR guy who's still with us today, Tim Gallen. And we called it Biotech Alley. And Cetus raised $300 million, which back in the late 1970s, 1980s, was off the chart. Chiron leased space from Cetus, and that was a company started by two brilliant people. It was by Bill Rutter and Ed Penhote, two friends, and they started Chiron. Now, their thrust was more egalitarian because they were professors. Cetus had professors, but they also brought in what we call a Hollywood star in the scientific community to change their culture. Ultimately, we pushed and others pushed those two to join and merge. But what happened was Chiron was a first example of a very small company that leased a small amount of space, raised a little money, had an idea validated, that continued to grow, that merged into a multinational company purchased by Novartis. And from there, a lot of people in Chiron started 5 or 6 companies. So you say, okay, how did this all come to be? Well, the traction is in innovation, and what we used to call in the old days incubation. How do you incubate someone? Well, someone who's working in a large company has an idea, but it's not going to be big money for 5 or 10 years. They want to pursue that interest. You have to have smaller spaces. You have to have, excuse the expression, cheap space. Cheap space that also can give services that that individual can afford on its own and on their own. So about 11 years ago, and Ed and I shared this, and I'm not a big fan of the individual, but a governor we had named Gray Davis was persuaded to do something very bright called QB3. It was Quantitative Bionetics 3. 3 being University of California, Santa Cruz, University of California, San Francisco, University of California, Berkeley. And what that was what we were doing in the private sector called incubation. It was, how do you get a bunch of people for a couple of $100 a month to validate an idea? They weren't even talking at the time about commercialization of research. They were talking about job creation. Because remember, it's politics, and political people always want to know, how do you create jobs and what's in it for me? Ultimately, it was good for the whole community, and there was an alignment of interests. Underline alignment of interests. Go back in history to Emeryville, and you have an alignment of interests, including quality of life. Now, quality of life gets shunted aside when development comes swooping through. But the great part about Emeryville was that even though they wanted to change and see their residential values change and increase, they had an idea that became a program that everybody bought into, as long as there was enough preservation of quality of life. Whether it was trees, and there was a planner in the old planning department who picked the absolute worst trees you could actually plant. But I think he got 2,000 free trees. So we had silver eucalyptus that we never should have been planted. You guys and your eucalyptus are killing us. We never got any lumber out of the deal either, just a lot of fire. But the idea was right. Change the concept. Back in 1978, because when I was 14, as I told you guys, I started Wareham. We're starting our 40th year. And what we did was we took an old building that had a lot of illegal uses, from research to epoxying tanks to illegal people living in spaces. And I went to the then director of redevelopment and planner at the time, because he did both. It was Mark Buell and Anderson at the time. And I said, we got to make this legal so I can get insurance. They said, we don't want these uses. We don't want to give social services. We don't want to pay for those type of uses. How can we do it? So they came up with a phrase to cover their butt called basically incidental residential. Now you say, well, what the hell does that have to do with life science? Well, those 1,200 square foot spaces, those 1,500 foot spaces, those 2,000 foot live-work spaces, not only brought artists, but it brought innovators, people who were working at home, people in the tech industry, because don't forget, Silicon Valley is south, but most of the knowledge, proprietary information, came from UC Berkeley, for most of Silicon Valley. And if you look outside the most recent years where Stanford would take over of who graduated there, most of the ideas in Silicon Valley came from UC Berkeley. And now UC Berkeley is into the nanotechnology. And I'll talk about nanotechnology, life science, energy in a moment. But where these little spaces came together was allowing people to live and work. That's an interesting concept. So you got the artists, now you got some live work. You're saying, okay, what the hell is he talking about? How does this tie together to commercialization? Well, Cetus and Chiron both were bigger companies. Chiron grew exponentially. Cetus was having trouble, but it had a lot of proprietary information. When they merged, the money from Cetus and the facilities from Cetus mixed with the egalitarian philosophy and hard-working knowledge of Chiron brought about certain serendipitous events. One of them was PCR. That came from Cetus and Chiron. Its applications is exponential across almost every sector in our life. You know it from crime and criminal, but it's also the basis of genomics. It's the basis of other areas of science. When that grew, other companies came out of that. In addition, there were other creative companies that came here besides research. Pixar was our company for 13 years in Point Richmond, which is a little further down the East Bay Shore. Steve Jobs came to me and said, I can't stay here anymore, even though I want to stay. And we have all their art, and we had all their original work that they did from Toy Story. He said, I can't recruit. I said, what do you mean? He said, for us to grow and recruit, besides our Pixar University where we teach people, we need to be closer to San Francisco so we can get people from Southern California, from the South Bay, from the North Bay. We're not centric right now in Point Richmond. Can you help me? I said, well, most developers don't like that type of thing because am I going to lose my tenant? But as it turned out, I'll tell you the story, it worked out well. He looked and really wanted Berkeley. But I'm going to go back to Berkeley and Berkeley's impact on Emeryville in a moment. Ultimately, Kaiser had this site locked up from Del Monte. And a competitor way back when, David Martin, had brought them there. But Kaiser couldn't get it together, and they saw some of the pitfalls and decided to centralize in one area of Oakland. And I heard about that. And we moved in with Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs obviously was a big figure, and the city loved him, and Pixar loved him. And the rest is history. I mean, it was an inverse takeover, Pixar really taking over Disney, if you want to know the truth. And Pixar continues to do great things today. But it was another creative element, because the site was there, but the private-public partnership was equipped to take advantage of the opportunity. The impediments weren't laid there, but proactively they said, here's what we need to make this happen. And Pixar donated to the art, to the schools, to a lot of educational improvements, and Emeryville needed that help at the time. And they became a great community citizen, but the community, even with its concerns about growth, brought them in and made it easier to attract. You say, someone asked about incentives. Outside of redevelopment, there haven't been that many incentives. Recently, the cap got raised for business license fees. And a reasonable Solomon-like compromise was worked out for the larger companies. So there's an incentive there. But ultimately, the dialogue is the incentive. The ability to say, we really want this, we really need this. We really need this, we really want that. Because location does trump, but quality of life issues also is quite important. Because if you look what happened, Berkeley in the 80s started passing legislation about proprietary information. And what's going to scare stockholders and the capital markets more than anything is when a government agency says, I want to know what you're doing and how you do it. And so CEDAS came from Berkeley. We brought, Sybase came from Berkeley originally before they left. A lot of companies came from Berkeley. We're the largest developer in Berkeley, and I got very angry during those political times, said, you know, I've had it. And we went on a building spree here in Emeryville. It wasn't just for that reason, but it accelerated the volume and the type of companies we were bringing. And because the city wanted that proprietary information, a lot of science and a lot of technology that didn't go to the South Bay and could not grow in Berkeley came to Emeryville. And so you had that political juxtaposition that also was an incentive that allowed growth to come. Now, everything is balanced. The pendulum swings this way, pendulum swings that way. What you want to know is, well, how did we bring this about? As Pat mentioned, we didn't have a connection to BART. The earthquake came in 1989. We had a development ready to go on the Westinghouse site, which was where the Emory Station campus is largely there. We also owned the Chevron site, which had to be cleaned up. At the time, the city manager, John Flores, called me, can you come to my office? Sure. Came to his office. The head of Amtrak was there. We need a train station. How do we get a train station? We don't feel that Oakland's going to give us a train station. I said, oh, all right, we'll build it. He said, you will? When? I said, when do you need it by? And he said, in a year. I looked at Flores, and Flores looked at me. We said, okay. How long will it take for you to get your act together back at Union Station in Washington, D.C.? And it was about 6 months. So essentially, John went to the political powers and his staff to come up with a plan, and we figured out a private-public way to do it. We took the footprint of where the station was going to be and parts of the platform. John said, we'll do some tax incremental bonds on the infrastructure, because at the time we couldn't move fast. So we divvied it up. We didn't take redevelopment money, and we said, okay, I'll do this on a break-even basis. Because I said, if we build this station, then you got to be a partner with me to build what we're doing all around. And he honored his word, as did the council, as did Pat, who was a great deal of staff time went into this, and we did it. And it was the first train station built in California in 50 years. Now think about that. In 50 years, there wasn't any other train station built. That's nuts. But it was built. It was 10,000 feet. They had a big ceremony and whistles and everything. I just got word last year they passed 3 million passengers that went through that station last year. That doesn't seem like a lot in a big infrastructure, but it's essentially Trans-Bay East that gets people to San Francisco. More importantly, it was tying into Intra, which is our Emory go-round, which is taxis, now Uber and Lyft and people like that. But the idea was it was left off a major infrastructure. How do you compensate for that? Well, you're not going to compensate by saying we're better or we can do this. You're going to have to provide that service one way or another. And the creativity became, as Pat mentioned, the Emory go-round. How did the Emory go-round get founded? John Flores and I talked about it, and he gave me 2 tickets to what we call the Lincoln Box. That would mean going to a place where you're going to get shot. There was an old man named Lathrop who controlled 2 or 3 shuttles, and I had to go grovel and bark like a dog to get him to come together with us. And we put together 3 or 4 power people who could use this system and make it work. And we took on the cost in the operation. The city got a grant from, of all places, some Caltrans, some PG&E money. I don't know how that happened, but it was only about $350,000. But the more important issue was the city went and used creativity. Where can we get a bunch of grants, and will you match us in this endeavor? Will you align your interests so we can get this transit moving? Last figures, the Emory go-round does free of charge, 7 days a week, averages somewhere around 8,500 to 9,000 passengers a day. It has GPS systems. We have dot racing. You can find at any moment in time where it's going to be, so busy people can be on their computer and know I have 5 minutes to the elevator down to the kiosk.
How do you fund it? How do you fund that Emory go-round?
How did we found it?
How do you fund it?
Oh, you just, it's a site, an application, and in every lobby you have how many minutes till the shuttle arrives.
Funding.
A transit authority.
The P-bid, yeah.
We get a couple questions in.
So I'm rambling on, and I think time's of an issue.
Right, and we're going to do the tour of the companies over at Emory Station, and after that, I understand we're going to reconvene in one of your conference rooms over there, where we can continue with Q&A?
Whatever you'd like.
Is that okay?
I mean, I've rambled as I promised I would, but basically I'll end by saying something that's super important. We've been called by 30, 40 cities, how do you do it? And it's not us, it's a convergence of forces. And if there's one or two items to remember, it's public-private partnership and not just using the words, putting some weight into it, and an alignment of interests. And the third point would be magnify the 60% of commonality and deal with the agreement to disagree in a civil way.
Okay. Thank you.